We'll just wait maybe 2 more minutes and then get started. Yeah. I think I will get started now because we want to hear Reza Aslan speak for as long as we can. And I do want to thank everybody who's joined us. I want to let you know that this is a webinar and you're all on mute and your videos have been switched off. The question and answer session will require you to submit your questions to the Q&A function, and you can do that any point in the conversation, but we will address them only at the end of the conversation. So thank you very much, Reza, for agreeing to be here today. It is an extreme pleasure to introduce you. Most of the people know you. We are honored that you have agreed to be in conversation with us as we continue the celebrations of our 20th anniversary, the 20th anniversary of the Center for Islamic and Arabic Studies at San Diego State University. The center would also like to use this occasion to thank Salim and Francois Shah for their generous donation, which will hopefully keep this center afloat forever. For those of you who are not familiar with Reza Aslan, he's an internationally renowned writer, commentator, professor, producer, and scholar of religions. His books, including his #1 New York Times bestseller, Zealot, the Life and Times of Jesus of Nazareth, has been translated into 17 languages. He has written 3 more books on religion, No God But God, Beyond Fundamentalism, and his most recent, God, A Human History. Reza Aslan has worked in a variety of television productions too, including a documentary series exploring world religions on CNN called Believer. And he's also serving as an executive producer on the HBO drama series, The Leftovers. He is a professor of creative writing at the University of California, Riverside. So, Reza, would you like to say a few words or should we start the conversation?
Well, just to say that I'm really grateful for this opportunity. Thank you so much, Huma. Thank you everyone at the Center for Islamic and Arabic Studies at SDSU. It's a great pleasure and an honor to be here. And I'm really looking forward to a lively conversation. I hope we get everyone else involved in this quickly.
Yeah, I hope so too, yeah. So, I mean, I've read all your books, but the questions that I'll ask will be based off the most recent, which is a fascinating book, and also for everybody who's listening, something to acquire. So based off your most recent book, God, A History of Humans, I felt that through an interdisciplinary approach and in a very accessible manner, you guide your reader on the discussion of God from polytheism to monotheism and use the concept of humanized God. I would like you to talk about this to our audience and explain and clarify what you mean by this.
Sure. Well, first, I think I wouldn't necessarily say that I discuss the evolution of God from polytheism to monotheism, although that is sort of the general trajectory around which so much of our conversations about the meaning of the divine tend to focus on. I think too often talking about God's evolution in terms of polytheism to monotheism indicates that monotheism is either the perfection of our concepts of God, like the end of that process of evolution, or it's a goal through which humans have been steadily progressing. And neither of those things are true. In fact, I do think it's important to recognize that although the vast majority of humans on earth today, whether they are themselves believers or not, when they think about the concept of God, they tend to think of God in singular terms, that the concept of a singular God is an extraordinarily new idea. And in fact, one of the things that I spend a lot of time talking about in the book is the fact that the concept of monotheism was repeatedly rejected, sometimes violently so, in human history because it doesn't make any sense. The idea that one God would be responsible for both good and evil, darkness and light, it doesn't compute. It just, the ancient concept that there is a God for each attribute or each emotion or each phenomenon is simply a more logical way of thinking about God. If I were to say what the endpoints of my particular human history of God is, I would say that in a way it's from animism to animism, or from the earliest forms of human spirituality, which is very much based on this concept that all things are animated by a singular united spirit, to what I conjecture will be the sort of the future movement of human spirituality, which is a version of that same concept, the idea that all things share a singular spirit. And that is, I think, sort of, if I were to say, what is the arc? That's the arc of the book and the arc of human history. And because of that extremely long prelude to your question, I've now forgotten the question.
So I'm going to repeat the question, and it's a good segue into the next one too. And we'll just go back and forth and
Yeah, why not?
clarify. So my question was that can you guide the reader through a discussion of polytheism and to monotheism, and you talked about that. But also maybe we can use the moment to elaborate on the distinction between religion and spirituality, and especially today's world, I'm finding many people, including my students and friends and relatives, saying, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual. And also, what is spiritual is taking on numerous forms of
Yes.
related to
Yes,
wellness,
indeed.
or all of those new terminologies. So it would be wonderful if we could talk to that.
This is actually that's a really important question. The most fascinating phenomenon taking place in the study of religions currently is the concept of the nons. Many people know what I mean when I say the nons. It's sort of a shorthand for the non-affiliated, but I will explain what I mean by that. So the term non-affiliated is a new one. The Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life has spent decades mapping American spirituality. They offer, some of you may have accidentally even taken this survey before. I know I did many, many years ago before I even knew exactly what it was that I was doing. They essentially send a survey to American households, asking them a very simple question: what are you? And what they do is they offer you a series of boxes to choose: Catholic, Protestant, evangelical, Mormon, Muslim, Jewish, atheist, agnostic, whatever the case may be. Now, what's really fascinating is that the latest version of the Pew Forum's survey of American spirituality showed that there is a marked decline in the number of Americans who self-identify as Christian. Now, there were some very breathless headlines about that marked decline, the end of Christian America. That decline is now 70%. So 7 out of 10 Americans self-identify as Christian. So we're a long ways from anything that could be remotely referred to as a post-Christian America. What was shocking, however, was that nearly 24% of respondents marked one of these three fields: atheist, agnostic, and non-affiliated. And the largest of those fields and the fastest growing of those fields is non-affiliated. Atheist is still something like 2.5% in America. It's a very small number. Agnostic is a little bit more growing. But non-affiliated has become a way of saying exactly what you just said: spiritual but not religious. It's kind of an alternative form of spirituality. These are people who could, if they wanted to, mark the box that said atheist. They could mark the box that said agnostic, but they specifically chose not to. They wanted to declare themselves as having some kind of spiritual longing, ill-defined as it may be. But most importantly, what they refuse to do is label that spirituality with a specific religious tradition. The question that scholars have been asking for the last 5-6 years is why? What's going on? This is by far the fastest growing movement in America. By the way, I should mention that 24% of all Americans mark that box. 66% of millennials marked that box. 2/3 of people under the age of 40 now refuse to identify with a specific religious label, and yet continue to express themselves in spiritual terms. Why is that? Well, there's been a number of reasons given for it. One of it has to do very clearly with the way in which religion and politics have become melded in the United States, really since the George W. Bush era. That we can track it very easily to the early 2000s when those numbers started to spike. And there is no question that there is a correlation between the way in which, in particular, the Republican Party and right-wing evangelical Christianity kind of merged into a single ideology, an ideology that has now led to 80% of white evangelicals supporting Donald Trump. And so that turned a lot of people away from Christianity, and those labels started to lose a lot of their adherents. We were also in the midst of a second wave of immigration, and a second wave that very expressly decided not to define itself in terms of Hindu, Muslim, or Jewish labels. So part of it is immigration, part of it is the political expression, part of it I think might just simply be the fact that we are in a moment in which the sort of simple answers given by religion are just simply not working to deal with the very real problems of a dying democracy and a dying planet that we're all facing. We don't know yet. It's too early. You know, I always joke that there are currently right now just a raft of PhDs being written right now to help us explain the enormous rapid growth of the nons. But it is a phenomenon that I think is certainly fascinating and bears very interesting conclusions about what this country is going to look like in the next 10, 20 years.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and the numbers are very fascinating. And as you say, it's the future that we have to look to. So I'd like to come back to the term you used in the book, humanized God. So I would like you to talk to that a little bit. And just off the cuff, do you think that this shift to spirituality, though of course those who follow mainstream religion would also refer to themselves as spiritual, but there's also the nons that you're talking about now. Are they trying to get away from the humanized God, or what is the role of that
So
humanized God in their
let
life?
me explain what I mean by the humanized God. When you look at the history of human spirituality, the way in which human beings have tried to make sense of and define the divine, what is unmistakable
Mhm.
is the way in which we have done so by transforming the divine into a human. In other words, by ascribing to the divine human emotions, human attributes, even a human physical presence, all in an attempt to make sense of something that is, you know, nonsensical, right? Something that is almost impossible to define. Now, what I talk about a lot in this book is that the most recent work being done by cognitive theorists, especially those who focus on religion and religiosity, um, essentially leads us to believe that this humanizing impulse is involuntary. It's embedded in our cognitive processes. In other words, we have no choice but uh, to think of the divine in human terms. And there are some very complex cognitive processes that are involved in that involuntary impulse that we can certainly get to in the question and answers. But
Mhm.
to me, what is really fascinating is not why we do it, but what the consequences of that impulse are. And the consequences are in many ways sort of, expected and obvious. On the one hand, what we do is we create a deity that can be understood, that we can have a meaningful connection with by transferring our emotions, our attributes to that deity. It allows us to draw a deep and meaningful connection with that deity that would be impossible if we thought of that deity as what, the divine technically is, sort of this all-encompassing, ethereal, universal, creative presence. On the other hand, by imparting our own emotions and our own attributes to the divine, what we end up doing is essentially divinizing ourselves. And in divinizing ourselves, what we do is we create a God who loves the things that we love and who hates the things that we hate,
Mhm.
who is angry and jealous, but also loving and compassionate, who thirsts for justice, but is also violent in the exacting of that justice. And in doing so, essentially what we end up doing is creating a system whereby everything that is good and bad about humanity becomes that which is good and bad about the divine. Of course, the difference being that the divine doesn't have any human limitations, right? The divine can do whatever the divine wants to do. And so that, it more than anything else, explains why, two people of the same exact religion can encounter the exact same scripture at the exact same time and walk away with two radically different interpretations of it, because fundamentally what they are reading is being filtered through themselves, through their own ideas, through their own prejudices and biases. And so one of the things that I try to do in this book is to lay out a means through which we can dehumanize the divine, whether we believe in God or not. This is a very important point that I should mention, is that the impulse to humanize the divine exists in atheists as well. And there are a number of very fascinating studies that I quote in the book about people who will say, I do not believe in God, that it's a fiction, it's ridiculous. And then when told, okay, fine, you don't believe in God, describe the God you don't believe in, they do what believers do, they describe themselves. They describe a divine version of themselves. And so I think what I talk about is that part of the process of having a mature, well-rounded spirituality involves making a conscious decision to dehumanize the divine, which is a very difficult thing to do. As I say, it's an involuntary impulse, but it is something that the great mystics of the world have been figuring out for, well, thousands of years, and it's something that we can learn from.
I do have a range of questions and would like you to speak to Islam, but after hearing you just, I'm tempted to drop in another question is, and you don't have to really answer it, but do you think also the impulse to politicize God has led to a lot of the humanizing, and therefore the dehumanizing may be harder and more difficult? And I'm thinking of, Hinduism with all the gods, and, Islam, Christianity,
Yeah, well, I would say it's actually, I would flip that question a little bit, that the involuntary impulse to humanize God means that not only do we give God our morality, but we give God our politics. When we create the divine in our image, which is what we do, we impart on the divine our likes and dislikes. And so that includes, obviously our politics, but it also includes our racial orientation, our sexual orientation, issues of gender. There was a fascinating study that came out only 2 years ago, I believe, at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, in which 250 respondents were asked a series of questions, visual questions, ultimately in order to create a vision of God as they saw that God. And obviously, as the researchers discovered, as I've already said, what they discovered was that, yes, we transform God into a version of ourselves. Darker skinned people made a darker skinned God, lighter skinned people made a lighter skinned God. But what was really fascinating is when you started to dig down deeper, younger people made a younger God, older people made an older God. When you go even further, it turned out that Republicans made a more masculine looking God and Democrats made a more feminine looking God. So your politics have so much to do with the way that you construct your image of God, because your image of God is essentially a mirror that you are holding on up to yourself.
Yeah, wonderful, fascinating. Yeah, we need to get hold of that report. Yeah, maybe.
University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill.
Yeah, I'll find it somewhere. Yeah, thanks a lot for that reference. Yeah. So I want to move on in a little bit of the Islam direction, and I'm going to you had a quote which I thought the audience would be interested in and have you discuss it. Is the quote was, Islam was seen not as a new religion, but as that of Abraham and Adam. So could you sort of, deconstruct that, where people think it's a new religion and,
I think it's very important to understand that this is true of all great religious traditions. Yeah, exactly. I think that we have this tendency to think of prophets as inventors of religion, right? A prophet shows up, and that's certainly how I think so much of the religions that arise from the prophet's followers, usually after the prophet's death, tend to define the prophet in these terms. There was an age of darkness in which there was no light, there was no understanding, and then out of the blue, an individual showed up with a brand new message that no one had ever heard before and created a brand new religion. I can't think of a moment in religious history in which that actually happened. I often try to remind people that Jesus was not a Christian. Jesus was a Jew reforming Judaism for other Jews. The Buddha was not a Buddhist. The Buddha was a Hindu reforming Hinduism for other Hindus. And the same is true about the Prophet Muhammad. Prophet Muhammad, as the Quran, by the way, repeatedly states, was at no point trying to establish a new religion. The term Islam did not exist during the Prophet's lifetime. Nobody called themselves a Muslim while the Prophet was alive. They called themselves companions, actually, or they called themselves the poor, or they called themselves companions. Interestingly, same with Christians, by the way. Nobody called themselves Christians during Jesus' lifetime. Christianity was a derogatory term that arose in the 2nd century. It was a way to denigrate the followers of Jesus. What they referred to themselves? Well, during Jesus' lifetime, they referred to themselves as Jews, because that's what they were. But after Jesus' death, they referred to themselves as the poor. It's very important to understand that prophets are like, I mean, the metaphor that I can think of is like, prophet is someone who throws a pebble into a lake. And it's those ripples that come out that then push other religious movements, other religious leaders to refine and resurrect those earlier ideas. The Prophet Muhammad, as far as he was understood, was simply resurrecting Abrahamic religion into the Arabian Peninsula, into an unbooked people, as he put it. This is the reason that this is so important. The reason that I spend so much time talking about it is I think we so often think of religions as separate and apart from each other. And we don't recognize how much the religions of the world utterly depend on each other, that they arose from each other, that the very DNA that they have inhered within them is scattered, across dozens of different religious ideas and religious communities. So it's a different way of thinking about what religion is, but more importantly, it's a reminder to all of us that we're not as far apart, religiously speaking, as we sometimes pretend that we are.
Yeah, I agree with you. And so would you assume, if Abraham was the originator or whatever, that there is an element of progressiveness that can then be part of all of the mainstream religions, because they sort of, is there an evolutionary trend, or why has religion become such a big political, social obstacle to, I'm talking about gender here, sexuality, all of those issues? The backlash is immense. So,
Yeah, well, the simple answer to your question is yes, of course, all religions are in a constant state of evolution. They are constantly adapting and changing to the changing needs of the community and the world in which they live. What you and I call Christianity today bears no resemblance to what Christianity was 500 years ago, even 100 years ago. The same is true of Islam. The Islam that we see in America looks very different from the Islam that we see in Indonesia, which looks very different from the Islam that we see in Cairo, which looks very different from the Islam that we see in Tehran, which looks very different from the Islam that we see in Senegal. Religions are not static, they're not monolithic, nor have they ever been. When a religion is static and monolithic, it dies. And the history of the world is littered with dead religions that were incapable of evolving and meeting the changing needs of their communities. So that's just a basic, obvious fact. Whether that evolution is towards progress or not, that's a little bit more up for debate, I guess, isn't it? The wonderful thing about religion, and this goes back to our earlier conversation, that if we are creating our religions, if we're creating our gods in our own reflection, and therefore our religions are sort of the institutionalized expression of our own sense of selves, then everything that's good and bad about us is going to be reflected in everything that's good and bad about our religions. That explains why religion can be such a force for good and evil, why religion can be responsible for incredible acts of compassion and social justice and horrifying acts of violence and oppression, because those religions are nothing more than institutionalized expressions of our internal beings. And as human beings, we are capable of both horrible acts of violence and beautiful acts of compassion. And so therefore, so is our religions. I often say that scripture without interpretation is nothing more than words on a page. It is meaningless. It requires an individual to read and encounter it for it to have any meaning whatsoever. But by definition, that means that the meaning comes not from the scripture, but from the individual encountering it. The scripture, in a sense, is neutral. In American history, 250 years ago, both slave owners and abolitionists not only used the same Bible to justify their differing viewpoints, they used the exact same verses to justify their viewpoints. Every horrible thing that you can find in any scripture, I can counter with a beautiful thing in that exact same scripture, and vice versa. It's all about the individual who is reading and interpreting that scripture. That's where the meaning lies.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that about the interpretations and the meanings. And then, of course, it's a political agenda that decides to then, highlight that particular one. And we are living in a world of different meanings and interpretations. So I think, I'm going to switch to your other book now.
Okay.
And I think this will be a good example for you to elaborate on and continue this discussion, because in From Beyond Fundamentalism, which also I enjoyed very thoroughly and use in my class, I want you to talk about the phrase you use, countering jihadism. Because the word jihad just sets itself up perfectly for exactly what you've been saying. Yeah, so let's use
Yeah.
a real word.
Yeah. So, I understand the hesitation for people to use the term jihadism. And I address this in the book itself, actually. I use jihadism because it's the term that jihadists use. Jihadiyya is it's their term. And so I think we should use their term. I also use it very specifically to indicate the newness of the ideology. I think so often when one is confronted by acts of violence carried out in Islam, there is a tendency to simply put a single interpretive umbrella over it all, and to ascribe the exact same objectives, goals, motivations behind that act of violence carried out by a Muslim somewhere in the world. But jihadism is extraordinarily unique. I think most scholars would say that it can be traced back to maybe the late 90s. It has partly to do with the experience of the war in Afghanistan, bringing fighters across nations all over the world who were forced, quite literally forced, to put aside their ethnic and national identity and to create a kind of uber identity that would allow all of their differing and sometimes conflicting grievances and agendas to fall together under a single umbrella, into a singular sort of identity that they could call their own. And so this kind of pan-nationalistic concept called jihadism arose. And very specifically, I use that term. I'm getting into the weeds right now, but the people at the Center for Islamic and Arabic Studies will appreciate this. Very specifically, I use jihadism in order to differentiate it from Islamism. Jihadism and Islamism are not the same thing. They're actually the opposite things. Islamism is a nationalist ideology predicated in one form or another on creating a, quote, Islamic state, whatever that means. It's never actually been defined or, frankly, successfully created.
Mhm.
Jihadism is anti-nationalist. Not only does a jihadist not want to create an Islamic state, a jihadist wants to get rid of the concept of state. The very idea of statehood and nationality is anathema to jihadism. And so that requires two different ways of countering it. In the case of jihadism, one of the things that I talk about a lot is that countering it requires understanding and actually addressing the grievances that help create the jihadist identity. Not because those grievances are necessarily legitimate, though often they are. I mean, you know, as bin Laden used to complain about climate change all the time.
Yeah.
I'm fairly certain bin Laden didn't care all that much about climate change. It was just a means of enlarging the grievance umbrella, if you will. But nevertheless, addressing those grievances breaks apart the identity structure that creates that sense of unity. And so part of the countering of the jihadist ideology is predicated precisely on breaking down and addressing the individual grievances that create that identity in the first place. That's a very simple way of
I know.
saying.
So you're giving me, when you say that the jihadists are anti-national, is there a group you can talk to or an example to make it clearer to us in the audience?
Oh, sure. So
Yeah.
The Muslim Brotherhood is an Islamist
Exactly.
organization.
Okay.
The Taliban is an Islamist organization. Hezbollah is an Islamist organization. That is not to say that their goals and agendas do not cross national boundaries, but it is to say that their primary motivation is geographical. Their primary motivation, Hezbollah's primary motivation, involves Lebanon. The Muslim Brotherhood's primary motivation involves Egypt, right? The Taliban, whether if you're talking about the Afghan Taliban or the Pakistani Taliban, it's different, obviously, but they have nationalist ambitions. Al-Qaeda is a jihadist organization. Islamic State is a jihadist organization. People say Hizb ut-Tahrir is a jihadist organization. Organizations that do not have a nationalist agenda, but have what is often referred to as a transnationalist agenda, right? Organizations who are utopian in a way, right? That's sort of what is truly appealing about these organizations, Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, whatever, Hizb ut-Tahrir, is that what they present their adherents is a utopian formula, right? And so that's why they tend to draw middle-class people, young people, educated people, wealthy people to them, people who have the wherewithal to consider such things as global transformation. Whereas nationalist groups like the Muslim Brotherhood or the Taliban or Hezbollah or what have you, Hamas, they draw the poor and dispossessed to them because their concern is very immediate. This isn't about some future utopia that we're going to build in which there are no more colors anymore, no more nationalities, we're all just Muslims and that's all that matters. If you are living in a pile of rubble in Gaza that used to be your home, global transformation is not a thing, right? You just want to eat and feed your family. And so that's why Islamism and jihadism draw different kinds of people to them. And that's why they require vastly different responses.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think it really cleared it up for me, at least, and for others. And especially when we read about these organizations in the, in the media and in newspapers or whatever people are reading these days, it's because there is, a lumping together of all of this, and there is way of homogenizing just Islam and everything else, and then stereotyping. So these differences are very important for people to understand. And I wanted to bring in a concept which may be of interest to the audiences, especially in terms of understanding Islam, and all the examples you've just given, is that of ijtihad. And where do you stand with that? And do you see it being utilized a little more in understanding the faith, or the younger generation picking up on it and questioning some stuff they're not very, happy about in so-called, traditional interpretations of the texts, the Muslim texts, this, Quran and, the Hadiths and all of that. So yeah.
Yeah, I think the problem with these conversations about ijtihad is that we're trapped in this false idea that somehow ijtihad is a thing that used to exist and doesn't exist anymore because somehow the gates were closed. There are no gates. They weren't ever opened or closed. That's just a thing that Bernard Lewis says, and we don't have to regurgitate, his words back to ourselves. Ijtihad means nothing more than independent reasoning. It has been a part of the interpretation of Islam from the very beginning. It has always been a part of the interpretation of Islam, and it remains an interpretation. It remains a part of the interpretation of Islam, particularly because what it provides is an understanding of the text at the individual level. Now, it is true that for much of the last 5, 6, 7, 800 years, that concept of individual interpretation has been retarded somewhat by the fact that the vast majority of Muslims could neither read nor write, and certainly didn't have access to the scripture themselves, right? It's a part of this thing that a lot of people who are listening here now certainly understand, which is that the Quran is meant to be read in Arabic. And as a result, what that has created is generation after generation of Muslims who, while perhaps able to vocalize the Quran, have no idea what the Quran actually says, and so have to rely on their religious leaders to tell them, to interpret for them what that meaning is. And yes, that has done a great disservice to the tradition of independent reasoning, which has been so much a part of Islam from the beginning. However, what we have seen in the last century, a century that has seen the Quran translated into more languages than the previous 14 centuries, is that for the first time, individuals have direct access to the scripture. And of course, thanks to increases in education and literacy, access to new and novel theories and ideas, the rising tide of globalization, which has allowed individuals to no longer be utterly reliant on their neighborhood mosque or imam, but who can just simply go to fatwaonline.com and get a fatwa in 24 hours from anyone, anywhere in the world that they choose. It has returned to Islam that sense of individual interpretation that is so much a part of the Muslim religion and the Muslim understanding. Now, that has, of course, led, I think, to greater fragmentation, which is something that I think a lot of Muslims, decry. There is, in Islam, this kind of, going back to the concept of utopia, this utopian idea of the Ummah as a united Muslim community, bonded as one, a single unit. It's a beautiful idea. It just never was really a thing. From 5 minutes after the Prophet's death, that was the end of anything that we could possibly call a united singular Ummah. What we have is hundreds of ummahs, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. And I think the greater we rely on individual interpretations, direct access to the Quran, unmediated expressions of Islam, the better I think it is for individuals, regardless of how it may continue to fracture the Ummah into smaller and smaller units.
Yeah, that's you're right, because now, and I'm glad you mentioned social media, there is an increase in sites that are answering questions, and of all kinds. And I'm working on LGBTQ issues among Muslims. I don't call it in Islam because it's a very different thing, and the number of websites that are there are very encouraging. And we talked about Hajj going online a few months ago, and to me that
Yes,
was very exciting too. Why not? Who can afford to
exactly.
pay and travel and all of that stuff? So yeah, it would be nice to see Ijtihad being put into action, and we see some changes. um, I am getting a lot of questions, and we
Okay,
want this to be a
that's
conversation.
good.
Of course, I don't know if you want to answer, but there's one brief question, which was the first one, is that what religion do you subscribe to? And
Oh, I'm a Muslim. Yeah,
yeah,
I identify as Muslim. Uh, I guess if I were to be more specific, I identify as a Sufi. Sufism is the tradition that I draw mostly from. I, of course, going back to an earlier conversation, understand the difference between religion and faith. I know that they are two separate things,
mhm.
that faith is individualistic and it's enigmatic and it is personal, and that religion is the language that we use to express faith. So Islam is the language that I use to express my faith, but my faith isn't in Islam. My faith is in God. Islam is how I express that faith.
Okay, thank you. That was wonderful. I'm sure I'll get questions on what is Sufism, but let's take a chance and see what the questions that have come up so far. And I'll just start with, we may be all over the map, but it's all related to things
That's
you
okay with
just
me.
said. Yeah. So somebody posted a question. You seem to indicate that if you're an atheist, you cannot be spiritual. Non-affiliated seems to me to believe in a God, but not affiliate with a religion, and is not a choice for an atheist. An atheist does not believe in a God or gods, but can be spiritual. Any thoughts?
As a matter of fact, I've written extensively on this subject, that atheism, not only do I absolutely not say that atheists can't be spiritual. On the contrary, I talk about atheism as a belief system. It is, like any other belief system, predicated on a series of postulates about the makings of the universe, postulates that are unprovable in the extreme. In fact, again, going back to sort of the data on this, there was a fascinating study at the University of Tennessee,
Okay.
and I want to say 2011. That one I'm not sure about, but University of Tennessee, the first and I think most complete study on American atheism indicated that 11% of atheists believe in a higher power. So absolutely, yeah. The other thing that I will say, going back, this is a Gallup poll. And it's not just Gallup, actually. There's been numerous polls to substantiate what I'm about to say. But in almost every category, atheists as a community are more moral than every other religious community in the United States. When it comes to the sanctioning of violence, atheists are more moral about the use of violence than Christians, Jews, Muslims, you name it. When it comes to the issues of compassion towards others. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. So I really, really hope that in my brief comments, when I mentioned atheism, I did not in any way express negative or critical comments, quite the contrary.
Okay, yeah. So we move on to the next one. It's a little long, but since humans are finite, another understanding of the infinite divine is therefore limited. How can one dehumanize understanding of the divine other than expanding one's horizon with understanding how various other peoples and traditions view the divine?
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. How can a finite being
Yeah.
understand an infinite being? And the answer is you can't. That the human mind is literally incapable of expressing what is fundamentally inexpressible. So the only thing that we can do is to make that infinite being no longer infinite. And that is the story of human spirituality from the days that we, when we were hunchbacked and lived in caves until today. We take our finite emotions, attributes, and characteristics, and we impose them upon an infinite being, thus humanizing that being and making that being easier to understand. How do we stop that? Through enormous cognitive effort. Enormous cognitive effort. It is not an easy thing. Again, I don't want to start making commercials for my own, particular religious tradition, but this is the heart of the Sufi discipline, is the recognition that the divine is not a thing that's out there to try to reach out and understand, that the divine is a thing in here that requires an awakening of knowledge to. In my book, God, A Human History, I talk about this as pantheism, the concept that all things are God and God is all things. And while many have said, well, that's just some newfangled spirituality, man. Actually, no, it's the original form of spirituality. It's the spirituality of our most ancient ancestors, according to both the archaeological data that's available to us and the sort of cognitive leaps of deduction that we can make based on what we know about the workings of the human brain.
Yeah, the person who sent the question, Bahar Davari, she's a professor of religion in University of San Diego, is saying she agrees. She's yeah. Move on. Another colleague of mine who also teaches at University of San Diego, Nechla Shirgi, she's asking, what is the relationship between religion and power? If people humanize the divine, why are most gods male?
Yeah. So you really cannot separate religion as an institution from power and politics. Early in the book, I talk about sort of this fascinating transition from our nomadic life to our sedentary life, what is often referred to as the agricultural revolution. For decades, the way that the agricultural revolution has been taught, it's how I was taught, was that human beings were hunting and scavenging, and then suddenly we decided to start planting and domesticating. And doing so forced us to stop moving. And when we stopped moving, we started building societies and villages and cities, and civilization was born. And then civilization required a sort of religious institutions in order to kind of maintain control over growing populations. And that's when, sort of the religions that we now come to understand had their origins. We now know that that is absolutely false. That is not at all what happened. We know this through unquestionable archaeological evidence that shows massive settlements across the Fertile Plateau that predate the rise of agriculture, sometimes by 1,000 years or more. So we did not settle down because we started planting. We started planting because we had already settled down. So why did we settle down? And if you look at the archaeological data, it's pretty clear why we settled down. We settled down because we started building temples. And when we built temples, we began to institutionalize the spiritual impulse. And the very process of institutionalizing that impulse is open the door to the power politics that is inextricably a part of religion in any form that we know it. It became about controlling that impulse, using it to the advantage of a few and the disadvantage of the many, creating a privileged class, the purpose of which is to maintain control over the idols and the temple. Who gets to come in? Who doesn't? Who gets to define those things? So to say that power and religion, are sort of married to one another is an understatement. I mean, the very birth of anything that we could conceivably refer to as religion arose as a direct result of the attempt to control and manipulate the natural, inevitable human impulse towards spirituality, and to go back to a phrase that we were using earlier, to turn faith into religion.
Thank you. Yes, there's so many. I think you may have to cancel your next Zoom. Just kidding. So yeah, another question is, you refer to the Islamic State as jihadist. Isn't their agenda the foundation of a caliphate, a transnational vision,
Yeah, so I think you misunderstood. So Islamism
I think so
is
too.
a nationalist ideology. This is important. So let's get this correct. Islamism is a nationalist ideology. It has as one of its fundamental goals the creation of an Islamic state. Jihadism is a transnational ideology. It has as its fundamental goal the ridding of all states, all borders, all boundaries, all nationalist identities, and the reconstitution of the globe as a single whole, obviously under their control.
Interesting question here. Can you speak on idolatry as a historical concept in Islam through your studies?
So when we're talking about idolatry, we are talking about the concept that the divine can reside inside a physical object. That is, I mean, the oldest spiritual expression. We have found idols that go back. We found one idol. It's called the Barakat Ram Venus, and it was found, I believe, in Israel, Palestine in 2009. I want to say, and that idol has been dated maybe between 300 and 350,000 years ago. So the concept of a physical object that houses some kind of manifestation of the divine is about as old a concept as it goes. In Islam, the idea of this kind of the smashing of the idols, right? Whether that's a historical thing or not, and there's reasons to doubt whether it is or not, has far more to do with this expansive conception of the divine as a universal being. In other words, as a being that cannot be contained in a particular object. It is as much a response to Christianity and the concept of the incarnation as it is to the sort of pagan, polytheistic, Jahiliya, Arab conception of the divine. I mean, the Arabs were, the pre-Islamic Arabs were incredibly sophisticated when it came to religion. No pre-Islamic Arab thought that piece of stone was actually God. I mean, that's our dumb sort of way of thinking about the ancient concepts of spirituality. Nevertheless, the idea that any piece of the divine could be separated from the whole of the divine and manifested either in a piece of stone or in the person of Jesus Christ was equally offensive to the early Muslims. And so although we spend a lot of time, I think Muslims spend a lot of time because it's such a part of our childhood stories, right? The breaking of the idols, you know, don't think of it in terms as being against idols as an idea, and think of it more in terms as the expression of an expansive definition of what the divine is.
That's true. You know, we grow up with these preconceived notions, and then, you know.
No, they're wonderful stories. It's a wonderful story.
Exactly. So, you know, I'm going to combine some questions because I think they're related. What are the criteria by which religions ought to be reformed? Islam, for example, because, for instance, if we were living under a powerful empire that did not recognize the values of the Enlightenment, which most reformers base their method and goals, would we have the same standards? Or is it a matter of the powerful and its influence on the other?
It's a very, very good, very sophisticated question. I would just sort of answer it in two very important ways. Number one, going back to the concept, if what you mean by reform is progress and evolution, well, we already know the answer to that. All religions are constantly in a state of evolution. Religions are in a constant state of progress. And religions that aren't go away forever. That's just what happens. If, however, what you mean by reform is the sort of more technical term for reform, the idea of a reformation that so often, you know, people talk about, this idea of a reformation, that what we need is a reformation. I think it's important to understand the Reformation means something very specific. Reformation does not mean the betterment of a religion. Like the Christian Reformation didn't make Christianity better. Nor were Protestants right and Catholics wrong, right? The Christian Reformation wasn't a battle between Protestant progress and Catholic intransigence. That's not what it was about. Reformation, this is true of the Jewish Reformation in the first century Palestine. It's true of the Hindu Reformation in the time of the Buddha. It's true of the Christian Reformation in the 16th century, and it's true of the Islamic Reformation. Is a conflict not over progress or the lack of progress, it's a conflict between individuals and institutions. As we said a minute ago, the moment in which the faith impulse was institutionalized, religion was born. And the minute that religion is born, it is now under the control of a select group of people who have been placed in charge of what that religion means, regardless of what the religion is. And in every great religion, there are multiple moments in history in which that battle between institutional control and individuals brings it up into the open, sometimes violently so. That process is what we refer to sort of generally as a Reformation process. Well, if that's what you're talking about, look around you, man. I mean, the Islamic Reformation has been going on for almost about 100 years now. I mean, you're living in the twilight of the Islamic Reformation. We were talking about this earlier when we were talking about ijtihad and individual interpretation, and the fact that individuals are now seizing for themselves a power that had been monopolized by the ulama for 1400 years to interpret Islam according to their own ideas. That is what reform and reformation actually means. And that, I think, is something that we're seeing across the spectrum in the Islamic world.
Short question here. Quran is a force for good and a mercy for mankind. What examples can we extract from it that would be considered as force of evil?
I mean, the same Quran that says if you kill one individual, it is as though you have killed all of humanity, also says slay the unbeliever wherever you may find them. Every scripture in the world has verses that promote peace and tolerance, and verses that promote violence and terror. The same Hebrew scriptures that says, love your neighbor as yourself also says, kill every man, woman, and child who does not worship Yahweh. The same Jesus who said, I turn the other cheek. And if your neighbor does not have a cloak, give him your cloak, also said, I've not come to give peace, but the sword. Look, it goes back to what we were saying before. Scripture without interpretation is just words on a page. No matter how divinely inspired you may think the Quran is, and I personally do think that it's divinely inspired, nevertheless, until someone encounters it, it doesn't mean anything. It requires someone to actually engage with it for it to have any meaning whatsoever. And so therefore, that meaning is going to be filtered through whomever that individual is. If you are a violent misogynist, your Islam is going to be violent and misogynist. If you are a peaceful pluralist, your Islam is going to be peaceful and pluralist. Islam doesn't make you one of those things or the other. You are one of those things or the other, and you transform your religion into your own beliefs. We do not derive our values from our scriptures. We insert our values into our scriptures.
Interesting point. Yeah. It's 3 people, interestingly, have asked, what is the origin of the word God?
Well, it's a German word, but the problem that I have about the word God is that it is probably the word that people use with the understanding that it has some kind of universal meaning, and that when you use it, the person who hears it is hearing the same thing that you mean. And at the same time, it is probably one of the most variable words in the English language. When anyone asks me whether I believe in God or not, my answer is, what do you mean by God? I mean, what do you mean? Like that could mean anything. I don't know what you mean by God. You may be referring to some old man who lives on a cloud in the skies and who roots for my football team. I mean, if that's what you mean, no, I don't believe in that God. You may be referring to, an individual who existed in a certain moment in time. No, I don't believe in that God. What do you mean by God? So if you're asking me, what do I mean when I use the word God? Okay, I can tell you that. When I use the word God, I mean the eternal, ever-present, creative force that impels the universe and that is the universe. So that's what I believe when I say I believe in God. But I know for a fact that when I ask someone else, oh, I believe in God. Do you believe in God? You believe in God too? Oh, look, we have so much in common. No, we don't. No, we don't. Let's define what you mean by God before we start to hold hands and sing Kumbaya.
Very well said. It's a good question. I would like to hear your response. You touched on the similarities between the religions of the world, and one common theme amongst them is the story of a great flood. And he's given examples. For example, Mesopotamia's epic of Gilgamesh and Abraham's Noah's Ark, the great flood of Guyu, etc. What do you believe leads cultures who have had no direct contact at their time of origin to have such similar divine stories? Is this related to the humanizing of God?
Well, in the case of the flood narrative, it's a really, really good question. In the case of the flood narrative, the most logical conclusion is that at a certain point, for various geological reasons, the Mediterranean Sea flooded. Because when you look at the origins of these flood narratives, you're right, communities that had no contact with each other, you see very clearly the outlines of where they all resided, and they reside in what could naturally be floodwater areas of the Mediterranean. So, you know, there's no evidence of this, but I think most scholars would probably say there was probably a flood. There was probably a flood, and everyone just kind of had their own, you know, version of it. What I think is instructive of the flood narrative, however, is that these versions didn't come up all at the same time. And what it indicates is what we had been talking about earlier, which is that so much of our religious mythologies are dependent on each other, that so much of how we understand the relationship between the human and the divine, so much about how we understand the concept of creation, you know, whether it's ex nihilo or whether it's a cycle of birth and death and rebirth, so much of that is dependent on earlier myths, earlier ideas that people were, that were just in the ethos, right? That they were just kind of a part of these early civilizations. Everyone kind of made these stories their own. And it's a reminder to us of more than anything else, of how much we rely on each other, even in our, you know, modern religious traditions, how much they link to each other, how wrong we are when we think of ourselves as separate and distinct, you know, without any relation to one another in our particular religious communities.
Okay, so I think I'm looking at the clock also, and you know, hoping that the hand stops, but it's not going to. So this is the last question, and then you know, we can take it from there if there's more time. But there are a couple of questions that are related to this, which is, can you address how the recent rise of Wahhabism has changed the face of Islam?
Yeah, well, it's not that recent, probably 150 years, but you know, nevertheless, I guess in the grand scheme of things, yes, it is recent. Again, you'll have to forgive me for constantly universalizing all of these questions, but it's important to understand that there is nothing unique about Wahhabism in Islam. Religious communities are focused on creating collective identities. In some ways, you know, some people would say that's the primary point. That's the whole goal of religion, is to create collective identities. In creating collective identities, what they tend to do is make us groups and them groups, in groups and out groups. And of course, as those communities evolve and continue to encounter, you know, changing social, cultural situations, they are going to continue to fracture and break apart. The in-group becomes smaller, the out-group becomes bigger. This is true of every religion in the world. It's just how the religious process works throughout history. However, in many religions, and this tends to be particularly true of monotheistic religions, not necessarily, but it tends to be more so than non-monotheistic religions. Why? Because, well, if you're monotheistic, chances are you are monomythic. In other words, if you believe that there is only one God, then you probably believe that there's only one path to that God. And if you believe that there's only one path to that God, that means all other paths aren't just wrong, they are anti-God. They are evil, in other words. So it is the case often in monotheistic religions that individuals feel as though those fracturings of the communities is, as we discussed earlier, a bad thing, a sign of decay in the community. And so what they want to do is they want to purify their communities. They want to return it to some kind of unadulterated, perfected, and frankly, totally imaginary past. We refer to them broadly as Puritan movements. There are Puritan movements in Judaism. There are Puritan movements in Christianity, in Hinduism, in Buddhism, and there are Puritan movements in Islam. The Puritan movement in Islam tends to be dominated by the Salafi Wahhabi ideology, the primary goal of which is to cleanse the community, right? Cleanse the community of its iterations, all the evolutions that have, crept into it, and to return it to this perfected, pure, past version of it, which never existed. It's totally a figment of their imagination. And oftentimes that perfected past looks a lot like their particular present, right? That's what Wahhabism is. Why was this tiny desert-dwelling puritanical cult so successful? $75 billion worth of Saudi oil money. That's why. It's not complicated. I mean, this is a cult that helped give birth to what we now call Saudi Arabia. And the Saudi clan thanked the Wahhabis by spreading that ideology to every corner of the world. Here's what I think is important. This is a great place to end. What we are seeing now, certainly over the last decade and a half, is a robust backlash to that Wahhabi Puritanism. And I think what you're noticing now in places like South Asia or in West Africa or in Europe or in the United States is a deliberate attempt to not just do away with that concept of puritanical Saudi version of Islam, and instead to double down on the indigenous version of Islam, the uniquely American version of it, the uniquely European version, or the uniquely West African version, etc., etc., and to actually celebrate those vibrant, sort of eclectic versions of Islam. Sheikh Hamza Yusuf, who's one of my dear friends and spiritual guides, has this beautiful thing that he says, where he says, Islam is water. It takes the shape of whatever vessel you put it into. America is a vessel, and Africa is a vessel. Indonesia is a vessel. And so it may look different, it may seem different, and that's okay. But fundamentally, the water is all water. It's all the same. So celebrate the different shapes, celebrate that indigenous aspect of it, and recognize the ultimate unity of Islam. And I think that's the key to not just ridding ourselves of this, archaic, puritanical form of Islam that has no role in the modern world, but of having a deep, meaningful, truly individual expression of what is a global faith.
Very well concluded, Reza. I think that was a perfect note and definitely fits into your whole talk today and our conversation. And of course, again, I sincerely want to thank you for being here, for giving off your time, for being a little late for your next meeting. But I hope these conversations will continue and we will see something that you and I believe in as being a progressive Islam very soon. Thank you very much. And thank you everyone very much to all of those who were attended and for all the wonderful questions. I'm really sorry I couldn't ask most of them, but I hope you had a good afternoon. Bye-bye.